Good afternoon. I'm here to present some work that my colleagues and I conducted in several from universities in the U.S. This was led by Megan Igo, who was one of our master's students at Texas A&M. And we also, as you look here, we had colleagues from Colorado State University, University of Missouri, and also California Polytechnic in obviously California. We titled this work Surveillance of Retail Tenderness in the U.S. And obviously those of you that have worked in the tenderness area for your career know how important that meat tenderness is for consumer acceptance. We've conducted a number of nationwide surveys, in fact 4 over the last 20 years, to evaluate what the relative tenderness is, especially at retail, and then over the years have also included food service and looking at beef and trying to understand some of the challenges that the industry faces with variation in tenderness. Now, the current survey was requested on behalf of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, on behalf of the Cattlemen's Beef Board in the United States, because there was this ongoing feel that there still are some issues with meat tenderness or with beef tenderness. And some of this goes back to concerns related to beta agonist use. And I can tell you during this time that 70% of the beef in the United States would have been fed one of the 2 beta agonists, either zolpadrol hydrochloride or ractopamine hydrochloride. That would not be the case today, but that was at least during this time period. 95% of the cattle in the United States would have been treated with some form of a growth promotant too on top of that. Over the past several years, there's been a greater use of distillers' grains as ethanol production has been used and has been ramped up. And there are statistics around 40% of the corn crop may be going towards that production of ethanol. And so what could that possibly have changed related to the intensity of the grain, the concentration of the grain and such? If you've read very much in the world news, at least in the United States, and have seen that we've been facing many droughts in the last several years, Texas has had several years of continuous drought. Our drought is a little bit less today. California has been in the news as far as facing a lot of drought. So whether or not that's stress related to drought could also have an impact on animals as far as their growth and their ability to produce tender meat. And then just other general concerns, maybe nothing that was concrete, but still this concern that needed to be able to evaluate and keep monitoring tenderness levels so we could find out whether or not that there's been any precipitous slide in tenderness or if it's been staying about the same. So in this particular study, the top loin, which would be the longissimus lumborum, was the muscle that was used and only at the retail counter. And so in this case, we selected products from 4 different U.S. cities and then evaluated those then for Warner-Ratzler shear, as well as slice shear force and consumer sensory panel, and then compared these ratings then these findings to the National Beef Tenderness Survey, the most recent one, which would have been conducted in 2010, published in 2013. So again, the 4 universities went out, selected product in these retail areas during 4 times of the year, so try to make sure that there was some variation in the time so that if there were seasonal effects, then that would be averaged across that. We selected product in Los Angeles, California, Denver, Colorado, Kansas City, Missouri, and then Houston, Texas, with an N of 1,613 samples. All the steaks that were collected then were frozen, other than those that we collected in the Houston area, where we would be close to the university and would have brought those back and then frozen there. But the products were frozen at the place, at the universities, and then shipped to us and with refrigerant to assure products would have arrived in the frozen state. Again, the three different ways that the products were evaluated were Warner Bratz for shear force, roughly half the steaks for slice shear force, and then a small proportion of those that would have been used for consumer sensory panel. This is just mean values for the Warner Bratz for shear and slice shear force. These are in newtons, and you can see here the top loin. One of the things that we found is that there were a number of bone-in top loin steaks, and so traditionally, probably today in the marketplace, would be primarily boneless products. But because we did find a number of bone-in products, we went ahead and sampled those and evaluated them also in here. There were differences. I don't have superscripts over on the shear force, on the slice shear force, but slight differences where the boneless were more tender. Now, a couple of tenderness surveys ago, we actually found that the bone-in steaks were more tender than the boneless, and we wondered at that time they were also thicker, whether or not that would have helped in the cooking process and some other things going on. This fact, when we looked at these steaks, they were actually quite thinner, and so it may also have been that the presentation and the marketing of these bone-in steaks were much more at trying to reach an economical price point for the consumer, where they would have been cheaper, fewer dollars per pound, at least in the U.S. market. So therefore, that might have been one of the things that would have been different about it. However, you look at those mean values, and they're still quite low when you look at those in newtons. For the consumer sensory, again breaking out the two, where you have the 6.9 and the 6.2 here. When you look at these, we have on a 10-point scale, and those have the overall like, tenderness like, flavor like, and juiciness like. And again, those mean scores are quite high and would be comparable to the tenderness evaluations we've had in the last two tenderness surveys. Now, it's very common for a lot of the consumer research or other kinds of research today to look at trying to put products in different categories, trying to see where they would fall. What mean values would they be closer in the like a very tender or a tender, intermediate, and tough category? And so these are based on the Blue et al. 2003 categorization of tenderness thresholds, and you can see in the upper right-hand corner of the screen then the cutoffs that had been used to be able to assess in this. So if you look again, 80 versus 76% of the two different steaks we had would have been in the very tender, 10.8, 12.7 for the tender, and then 5.1, 6.8 for intermediate, and then only 3.2 and 4.2 would have been categorized in the tough area. And that would also then be, if you look, those would be categories, those would be above 45.1 newtons. Now, when you compare this to the previous tenderness survey, which would be conducted in 2010 and would be published as Gelker et al. 2013, you see that the ratings are very similar as you go through. Now, again, 80 to 84.8, and again, almost identical in the tender category. Slightly more when you look at the intermediate and tough in that, but again, I don't think that that's enough to indicate that there's been anything where there's been a substantial shift or anything in tenderness. One of the things that's of great interest right now is USDA in the United States Department of Agriculture and the Ag Marketing Service does have a category now that is USDA tender. There's also USDA very tender also. And the marketing claims have been developed, been committees of people that have worked on this, and this is a citation you can find to be able to look at the ASTM standards for this. And this is actually over on the right-hand side. This is actually a retail product that I found and took a photo of that has the USDA certified tender. So there's 2 or 3 retail chains in the United States that are now starting to feature some of the product, and there's growing interest in this area. For this tenderness claim, at least for the certified tender, the maximum tenderness threshold value, or what's referred to as the MTTV in the standards, would be either, if you're going to measure Warner Brasser shear as kilograms, would be 4.4 or 43.1 Newton. Slice shear force would be 20 kilograms or 196.1 Newtons. So if you look at this and you look at those values, you see that the values across time on the tenderness survey, including the current assessment that we have, continue to have come down and have probably leveled off on that, with the best numbers, I guess if you want to consider the lowest numbers the best, actually being in 2006. But again, from a top-line comparison across those, you would see that the first one would have been 31.9, and now we're in the 23, 24. In my career, I can remember that if we thought that something had less than 4.5 kilograms, or again, less than 45 newtons, I remember how thrilled we were that that would be probably something to be very tender. To see that we have products that are in this range today is still very, very great, or very acceptable, or probably even more lower than what we ever would have thought that they would have been. And so I'm still amazed that we're having values that are in the 23, 24, or the 2, 3 kilogram versus the 4 or 5 that we would have seen more common. So for an overall conclusion, we said that we think that the shear force values and the slice shear are very comparable to what we've seen in the last couple of surveys. It doesn't appear that there's anything where there's been a precipitous decline or a precipitous increase, if you want to look at it that way, from a shear force value. And what's interesting when you look at the information from this, that roughly about 85% of the retail cuts would have qualified for the certified tender category today. So I believe that we feel like that there's been great progress made. There's probably a lot of things that have happened. One of the things that we have seen in the retail market, probably 2/3 of the beef that you will see sold today is in some branded program. And a couple of years ago, we would have had probably about 40%. And probably if you'd gone 20 years ago, it would have been very, very little of it. So the fact that retailers or packers are branding product probably indicate that there's greater care related to, aging programs, selection programs, and other things that might help to ensure that products are more tender today than what they had been in the past. So that's my presentation, and I'll see if there's any questions that anybody may have.
Thank you.